Her voice carried through the house, sharp and precise, like the edge of a knife. "Chris, can you at least pretend to care about your responsibilities?" she snapped from the kitchen. I froze at the bottom of the stairs, gripping the banister. Another lecture. Another day of her asserting control over a house that wasn't even hers to begin with. "I'll take care of it," I muttered under my breath, though not loud enough for her to hear. Better to say nothing than start another argument. The morning sunlight streamed through the windows as I entered the kitchen, finding her standing by the sink, her hands busy scrubbing a coffee mug. Amanda's blonde hair was pulled into a tight ponytail, her posture as rigid as the tone she always used when addressing me. She glanced over her shoulder, her eyes narrowing at my slouched figure. "Your father asked you to mow the lawn 3 days ago," she said, turning back to the sink. "You're not a child anymore, Chris. It's time you started acting like an adult." I rolled my eyes but didn't respond. The tension between us had been simmering ever since Amanda moved in 2 years ago. She was Dad's second wife, and while he seemed smitten with her, to me, she was little more than a glorified intruder. She had an uncanny way of making every conversation feel like a confrontation, as if her mission in life was to prove her superiority. "Are you even listening?" she asked, turning to face me fully now. "Yeah," I replied flatly. "I'll do it later." "You've been saying that for days," she said, crossing her arms. Her eyes were a piercing blue, cold and unforgiving. "Your father works hard to keep this house running, and the least you can do is contribute." My jaw tightened. I said, "I'll do it." She studied me for a moment, her lips pressing into a thin line. Finally, she sighed and turned back to the sink. "Fine. Just make sure it's done by the time he gets home." I left the kitchen without another word, the weight of her disapproval clinging to me like a heavy coat. Upstairs in my room, I collapsed onto the bed, staring at the ceiling. It wasn't like I didn't help around the house. I did plenty, but no matter what I did, it was never good enough for Amanda. She always found something to criticize, some way to remind me that I wasn't living up to her expectations. Dad didn't see it, or if he did, he chose to ignore it. He was too wrapped up in his new marriage, too busy playing the role of the doting husband to notice the cracks forming in the family he'd tried to rebuild. It wasn't just the way Amanda treated me. It was the way she seemed to control everything. From the way the furniture was arranged to the meals we ate, every aspect of our lives was meticulously curated by her. The hours slipped by as I lay there, my thoughts circling like vultures. Eventually, the sound of Amanda's voice broke through my reverie. She was outside talking to someone. I got up and peered out the window, spotting her standing in the driveway with our neighbor, Mr. Hendricks. They were laughing about something, their conversation easy and natural in a way it never was with me. I felt a pang of something, not jealousy exactly, but a sense of being excluded, of not belonging in my own home. Shaking my head, I grabbed my phone and earbuds and headed downstairs. The lawn wouldn't mow itself, and the last thing I wanted was another lecture from Amanda. By the time I finished, the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the yard. I put the mower away and trudged back inside, sweaty and exhausted. Amanda was in the living room, a glass of wine in her hand as she flipped through channels on the TV. She didn't acknowledge me as I walked past, and for once, I was grateful. Later that night, as I sat at the kitchen table finishing some homework, Amanda entered the room. She paused in the doorway, watching me with an unreadable expression. "Chris," she said, her tone softer than usual. "Can we talk?" I looked up, wary. "About what?" She sat down across from me, her glass of wine still in hand. "I know things haven't been easy between us," she began, her voice measured. "But I want you to know that I'm not your enemy. I care about this family, and that includes you." I stared at her, unsure how to respond. This was new. Amanda wasn't one for heartfelt conversations or emotional vulnerability. "Okay," I said cautiously. "I'm serious," she continued. "I know I can be hard on you, but it's only because I see so much potential in you. I just want to see you succeed." I blinked, caught off guard by the sincerity in her voice. For a moment, I almost believed her. Almost. "Thanks," I said, though the word felt foreign on my tongue. She nodded, a small smile tugging at the corners of her lips. "Good night, Chris." "Good night," I replied, watching as she left the room. As I sat there alone, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. Whether it was a crack in her armor or just another calculated move, I didn't know. But for the first time in a long time, I felt like we were on the verge of something. Something that could either mend the rift between us or tear it open even wider. The days after our late-night conversation were strange, almost surreal. Amanda seemed different. Her usual sharp edges were dulled, replaced by a softness I didn't recognize. She stopped nagging me about chores, stopped throwing thinly veiled criticisms my way. Instead, she'd ask how my day was, her tone light and genuine. It felt disarming, as if she were trying to rewrite the dynamic we'd spent years building. I didn't trust it. One afternoon, as I sat in the living room flipping through channels, Amanda walked in carrying a tray of snacks. She set it on the coffee table and sat down on the couch, her movements uncharacteristically casual. She was wearing jeans and a sweatshirt instead of her usual perfectly pressed outfits, and her hair was loose, tumbling over her shoulders in waves. She looked more approachable, less like the woman who had spent the last 2 years making me feel like a guest in my own home. "I thought you might be hungry," she said, gesturing to the tray. "I made some sandwiches." "Thanks," I said hesitantly, glancing at her out of the corner of my eye. She smiled, picking up a sandwich for herself. "You've been working hard lately. I've noticed." I paused mid-bite, caught off guard by the compliment. Amanda rarely acknowledged my efforts, let alone praise them. "Yeah, well, someone has to keep things running around here," I said, unable to keep the bitterness out of my voice. Her smile faltered, and she set her sandwich down. "I deserve that," she admitted. "I know I haven't made things easy for you. I've been harsh. Too harsh." I stared at her, unsure how to respond. This wasn't the Amanda I knew. The Amanda I knew would have doubled down, turned my words against me. But now, she looked almost vulnerable. "Why are you being so nice?" I asked, narrowing my eyes. "What's your angle?" She sighed, leaning back against the couch. "No angle. I've just been thinking a lot lately. About this family. About us. Us." I repeated, my voice skeptical. "Yes, Chris," she said softly. "You and me. I've been so focused on trying to fit into this family that I didn't stop to think about how hard this must be for you. Losing your mom, adjusting to me being here, it's a lot. And I haven't made it any easier." Her words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. I didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted to believe her, to let go of the resentment I'd been holding on to for so long. But another part of me couldn't shake the feeling that this was too good to be true. "It hasn't been easy," I admitted, my voice quiet. "But you're right. It's been hard for you too." She looked at me, her expression softening. "Thank you for saying that. It means a lot." The conversation ended there, but something about it stayed with me. For the first time, it felt like Amanda and I were on the same page, like we were finally starting to understand each other. It was unsettling, but also strangely comforting. That night, I stayed up late, lying in bed and staring at the ceiling. My thoughts kept circling back to Amanda, to the way her tone had softened, the way her eyes had looked almost sad. It was a side of her I'd never seen before, one that made me question everything I thought I knew about her. The next morning, I woke to the sound of laughter coming from the kitchen. I got up and made my way downstairs, finding Amanda and Dad sitting at the table, their coffee mugs in hand. They looked happy, relaxed in a way I hadn't seen in years. "Morning, Chris," Dad said, smiling at me. "You're up early." "Couldn't sleep," I said, grabbing a mug and pouring myself some coffee. I sat down at the table, my eyes flicking to Amanda. She gave me a small smile, her earlier vulnerability replaced by her usual poise. Dad glanced between us, his expression curious. "You two getting along better?" he asked, his tone light but probing. "We're working on it," Amanda said, her voice steady. "Right, Chris?" "Yeah," I said, nodding. "We're working on it." Dad's smile widened. "That's great to hear. I've always wanted us to be a real family." Amanda reached over and squeezed his hand, her gaze soft. "We're getting there," she said, her words carrying a weight I didn't fully understand. As I sipped my coffee, I couldn't help but feel like things were changing. The walls that had once divided us were starting to come down, brick by brick. But even as I tried to embrace this new dynamic, a part of me remained on edge, waiting for the other shoe to drop. The shift in our relationship didn't go unnoticed, not by me and certainly not by Amanda. She seemed more at ease now, her movements around the house less calculated and more natural. The tension that had once filled every room felt like it was finally beginning to dissipate. But even as things improved, there was an undercurrent of something I couldn't quite place. Something unspoken, lingering in the air between us. One evening, Dad announced that he had a business trip coming up. He worked in sales and often traveled for work, but this time, it was a week-long conference in Chicago. "I'll be back next Friday," he said over dinner. "You two think you can survive without me?" Amanda smiled, her tone light. "I think we'll manage." I nodded, keeping my eyes on my plate. The idea of spending an entire week alone with Amanda made my stomach twist, though I couldn't quite pinpoint why. Things have been better between us lately, but the thought of that much time together felt unsettling. When Dad left early Monday morning, the house felt strangely empty. The absence of his presence was palpable, and for the first time, I realized how much he had served as a buffer between Amanda and me. Without him there, the silence between us felt heavier, more intimate. Amanda took the opportunity to clean out the garage, a project she had been nagging Dad about for months. I offered to help, partly out of guilt, and partly because I didn't want to leave her to do it alone. We spent the better part of the afternoon sorting through boxes and hauling junk to the curb. It was exhausting, but there was something oddly satisfying about the process. As the sun began to set, Amanda wiped her forehead with the back of her hand and sighed. "Well, that's one thing off the list," she said, her tone lighter than usual. "Looks good," I admitted, surveying the now-organized garage. She smiled, and for a moment, the tension that had always existed between us seemed to fade entirely. "Thanks for helping," she said. "I couldn't have done it without you." "No problem," I replied, though her gratitude caught me off guard. Amanda wasn't one to dole out compliments easily, and the sincerity in her voice left me feeling unsteady. That night, after dinner, Amanda poured herself a glass of wine and settled onto the couch. I was heading upstairs when she called out to me. "Chris, come watch this with me," she said, holding up the remote. I hesitated, one foot on the staircase. "What is it?" "Just a movie I found," she said. "Come on, it'll be fun." Against my better judgment, I joined her. The movie was some indie drama I'd never heard of, slow and atmospheric. Amanda seemed engrossed, her attention fixed on the screen. I tried to focus, but I was hyper-aware of her sitting next to me, the faint scent of her perfume lingering in the air. Halfway through the movie, she leaned over to grab her wine glass from the coffee table. Her arm brushed against mine, and I tensed instinctively. She noticed, her eyes flicking to me with a curious expression. "Relax, Chris," she said with a soft laugh. "I'm not going to bite." I forced a smile, though my heart was pounding. "Sorry," I muttered, shifting slightly to put some distance between us. She didn't say anything else, but I could feel her gaze lingering on me for a moment before she turned back to the movie. The rest of the evening passed in a blur, and by the time I went to bed, I felt like I was crawling out of my skin. The next few days were a delicate balancing act. Amanda's behavior remained warm, almost affectionate, but I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to it than met the eye. She'd brush past me in the hallway, her touch lingering just a fraction too long. Her compliments, once rare, now came frequently, each one laced with an undertone I couldn't decipher. One night, as I was finishing up some homework in the dining room, Amanda walked in wearing a robe, her hair damp from a shower. She leaned against the doorway, a glass of wine in her hand. "You're always working so hard," she said, her voice soft. "Your dad would be proud." I looked up, startled by the comment. "Thanks," I said cautiously. She stepped closer, her gaze steady. "You're a good kid, Chris. I know I don't say it enough, but you really are." Thanks," I repeated, feeling a flush creep up my neck. For a moment, she just stood there, her eyes searching mine. Then she smiled and turned to leave. "Good night, Chris," she said over her shoulder. "Good night," I replied, my voice barely above a whisper. As the door to her bedroom closed, I sat there, my mind racing. Something was happening between us, something unspoken but undeniable. I didn't know what it was or where it was leading, but one thing was certain. Things between Amanda and me would never be the same. The morning sunlight streamed through the windows, but the brightness felt at odds with the tension building inside me. The days without Dad in the house had taken on an unsettling rhythm. Amanda and I were coexisting in this strange liminal space, an unspoken understanding lingering between us that neither of us dared to address. It wasn't hostile, but it wasn't comfortable either. It was something else entirely, something I couldn't name. That Friday morning, Dad's absence weighed heavily on me. I hadn't realized how much his presence had anchored the house. Without him, every interaction with Amanda felt amplified, every glance a little too long, every silence a little too loud. I busied myself with breakfast, hoping to keep things as neutral as possible. Amanda came down the stairs wearing a loose sweater and jeans, her hair pulled into a messy bun. She looked more casual than I'd ever seen her, but somehow that made her presence even more disarming. "Good morning," she said, her voice softer than usual. "Morning," I replied, keeping my eyes on the scrambled eggs I was pushing around on my plate. She poured herself a cup of coffee and leaned against the counter, watching me. "You sleep okay?" she asked, her tone almost tentative. "Yeah," I lied. In truth, I'd barely slept at all, my thoughts a tangle of confusion and unease. "Good," she said, her gaze lingering on me for a moment before she turned to look out the window. "Your dad called this morning. He said his flight's been delayed, so he won't be home until late tonight." "Oh," I said, my stomach tightening. "Okay." She didn't say anything else, but the silence that followed felt heavy, like an invisible thread tethering us together. I finished my breakfast quickly and excused myself, retreating to my room in search of some semblance of normalcy. The hours crawled by, each one stretching longer than the last. I tried to distract myself with homework and video games, but my focus kept slipping. Amanda's presence lingered in the back of my mind, an ever-present reminder of the strange dynamic that had taken hold of the house. By the time evening rolled around, I couldn't avoid her any longer. I came downstairs to find her in the living room, a glass of wine in her hand and a movie playing on the TV. She looked up as I entered, her expression unreadable. "Hey," she said, "I ordered pizza. It should be here soon." "Cool," I said, sitting down on the far end of the couch. The space between us felt like a chasm, but the air was charged with something I couldn't define. We watched the movie in silence for a while, the sound of the dialogue filling the void. When the pizza arrived, Amanda brought the box to the coffee table and handed me a plate. "Thanks," I said, avoiding her gaze. "You're welcome," she replied, her tone light but tinged with something deeper. As we ate, I felt her watching me, her eyes tracing my movements. It wasn't the critical gaze I'd grown used to over the years. It was something else, something that made my pulse quicken and my chest tighten. I tried to ignore it, focusing instead on the movie, but my concentration faltered under the weight of her attention. When the credits rolled, Amanda leaned back against the couch, her glass of wine resting on her knee. "I don't know about you, but that was one of the worst movies I've ever seen," she said with a laugh. I couldn't help but smile. "Yeah, it wasn't great," I admitted. Her laugh faded, and she turned to look at me, her expression softening. "It's nice, though," she said quietly. "Spending time like this. Just the two of us." I swallowed hard, my throat suddenly dry. "Yeah," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. The room felt impossibly small, the space between us shrinking with every passing second. I could feel the warmth radiating off her, the faint scent of her perfume lingering in the air. My heart pounded in my chest, a chaotic rhythm that matched the confusion swirling in my mind. "Chris," she said softly, her voice almost a whisper, "I want you to know, I'm really proud of you. You've grown up so much these past few years. I know I don't say it enough, but I see it, and I appreciate you." Her words hit me like a tidal wave, the sincerity in her voice cutting through the fog of doubt and mistrust. I didn't know what to say, didn't know how to process the sudden shift in our dynamic. "Thanks," I managed, my voice trembling. She reached out, her hand resting lightly on my arm. The touch was brief, but it sent a jolt of electricity through me, leaving me breathless. She pulled back quickly, her cheeks flushing as she looked away. "I should probably get to bed," she said, her tone abruptly changing. "It's getting late." "Yeah, me too," I said, standing up and grabbing the empty plates from the coffee table. My hands shook slightly as I carried them to the kitchen, the weight of what had just happened pressing down on me. As I lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, my mind raced. The line between us had always been clear, a boundary neither of us had dared to cross. But tonight something had shifted. The boundary had blurred, leaving me caught between confusion and a growing sense of unease. The sound of Amanda's soft laughter echoed in my mind, a reminder of the evening we'd shared. For the first time, I felt like I'd seen a side of her that no one else had, a glimpse of the person she was behind the carefully constructed facade. And as much as I wanted to push the thought away, I couldn't help but wonder what it all meant. Whatever it was, I knew one thing for certain. Things between Amanda and me were no longer as simple as they once seemed, and there was no going back to the way things were. The next morning, I woke with a strange heaviness in my chest, a residue of the night before that I couldn't quite shake. Amanda's words, her touch, her lingering gaze, they looped in my mind like an unresolved chord, refusing to fade. The house was quiet as I got dressed and went downstairs, the early sunlight casting long shadows across the living room floor. Amanda was already in the kitchen, sipping coffee and scrolling through her phone. She looked up when I entered, offering me a soft smile that felt almost knowing. "Morning," she said, her tone light but warm. "Morning," I replied, keeping my voice even as I grabbed a mug and poured myself some coffee. The air between us felt charged, like the faint hum of static electricity before a storm. I avoided her gaze, focusing instead on the steam rising from my mug. Amanda didn't press, letting the silence stretch comfortably until she finally stood and walked to the sink. "Your dad called," she said, her back to me. "He'll be home around dinner time." "Okay," I said, relief and apprehension washing over me in equal measure. Dad's return would restore the normalcy I so desperately craved, but it would also force me to confront the changes in my relationship with Amanda, changes I still couldn't fully comprehend. The rest of the day passed in a blur. I spent most of it outside, mowing the lawn and cleaning up the yard, anything to keep myself occupied. Amanda stayed inside, her presence a constant but distant shadow. We were avoiding each other, though whether it was deliberate or unconscious, I couldn't say. By the time evening rolled around, the house was spotless. Amanda had cooked dinner, the scent of roasted chicken and garlic filling the air. She'd set the table with a precision that felt almost ceremonial, the soft glow of the dining room lights casting everything in a warm, golden hue. When Dad finally walked through the door, his voice booming with cheer as he greeted us, the tension that had gripped the house seemed to dissipate, at least on the surface. Amanda wrapped her arms around him, her laugh bright and easy as she welcomed him home. I watched from the kitchen doorway, a strange mix of emotions churning in my chest. Relief, guilt, something else I couldn't name. Over dinner, Dad regaled us with stories from his trip, his energy infectious. Amanda hung on his every word, her laughter genuine, her gaze adoring. To anyone else, she would have seemed like the perfect wife, the glue holding our family together. But to me, she was a puzzle, her actions over the past week clashing with the image she presented now. "Chris," Dad said, pulling me out of my thoughts. "You okay? You've been awfully quiet tonight." "Yeah," I said quickly. "Just tired. It's been a long day." He nodded, accepting my answer without question, and turned his attention back to Amanda. The conversation continued, but I barely registered it, my mind too preoccupied with the weight of everything that had transpired in his absence. Later that night, as I lay in bed, I heard their muffled voices drifting up from the living room. Amanda's laugh was soft, her tone playful, and for a moment, I felt a pang of something akin to jealousy. Shaking my head, I rolled over, willing myself to sleep. But it didn't come easily. The next few days were a return to routine. Dad went back to work, and Amanda and I fell into the familiar rhythm of polite coexistence. On the surface, everything seemed normal, but beneath it all, there was a tension that neither of us could ignore. Every glance, every passing interaction, felt laden with unspoken words, the memory of that night on the couch lingering between us like a ghost. One evening, when Dad was working late, Amanda knocked on my bedroom door. I hesitated before opening it, my heart pounding in my chest. "Hey," she said, leaning against the doorframe. She looked tired, her hair pulled back in a loose ponytail, her face free of makeup. "I just wanted to check in, see how you're doing." "I'm fine," I said, my voice guarded. "Why?" She shrugged, her gaze steady. "You've been quiet lately. I want to make sure everything's okay." "Everything's fine," I said, though the words felt hollow. She didn't move, her expression unreadable. For a moment, it felt like she was about to say something else, but then she simply nodded. "Good night, Chris," she said softly. "Good night," I replied, closing the door as she walked away. As I lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted again. Amanda's presence lingered in my mind, her voice echoing in the quiet. I didn't know what to make of it, didn't know how to navigate the strange new reality we'd found ourselves in. In the weeks that followed, life returned to a semblance of normalcy. Dad remained oblivious to the undercurrent of tension between Amanda and me, his focus on work and his marriage. Amanda, for her part, seemed to retreat behind her carefully constructed facade, her interactions with me polite but distant. It was as if we'd both silently agreed to pretend that nothing had happened, to bury the past and move forward. But some things couldn't be buried. The memory of that week lingered, a constant reminder of the line we'd come dangerously close to crossing. It was a weight I carried with me, a secret I couldn't share, a question I couldn't answer. As the months turned into years, the distance between Amanda and me grew, but so did our understanding of each other. She remained a part of my life, a complex figure I couldn't fully unravel. And while we never spoke of that week again, its impact shaped the way we moved through the world, the way we saw each other. In the end, it wasn't about what had happened or what might have been. It was about the choices we made, the boundaries we set, and the lives we built despite the cracks in the foundation. And as I stood on the edge of adulthood, ready to carve out my own path, I knew one thing for certain. The past would always be a part of me, but it wouldn't define me. And in that, there was freedom,